In just a few short days, we'll know the results of the US election and the likely implications for the EU and Ukraine. On the Europe conversation, I catch up with Ian Lesser of the German Marshall Fund, who says no matter who wins, America will remain deeply polarised. So, Ian, welcome to the Europe conversation here on Euronews. Look, why don't we start with a little prediction? Because this time last week we'll know how America voted, more or less, but we may not have a clear idea of who's going to be the next president.
You may still not know, because it's so close that it could easily be contested in various states. There may have to be recounts. We'll have to see. The polls all seem to say the same thing, which is that the country is very evenly split, and it comes down to a few states and a few people in a few states, and whether they come out to vote or not.
I mean, are there indications that we could see a repeat of what happened the last time, where in Georgia, for example, Donald Trump demanded he get 11,800 votes because that's the amount he needed to win the state, that you might have some sort of interference and then disinformation about stolen ballots and so on?
Well, I mean, there's always a risk of this. And, of course, the concern about this has been growing over the last years. On the other hand, everyone is watching. It's not as if there is a lack of transparency. And the systems, in fact, are very strong, but they're also very legalistic, and there can be many legal challenges, even legitimate legal challenges if it's very close. So, it's quite conceivable that even a few days afterwards, you really won't know who won.
OK, so let's look at it from an EU-US perspective. What are the issues that the EU need to be concerned about, regardless of who's president?
Well, I think above all, Europe wants predictability from Washington. Predictability on trade, predictability on security, predictability on regulation, all the sorts of things that European stakeholders and governments care about. And of course, that's not always in large supply with any administration. But of course, there was an experience with former President Trump, and that was a very unpredictable experience for Europe. He's said a lot about tariffs. He's said a lot about putting increasing pressure on NATO in particular, maybe not supporting Ukraine in the way that we've seen in the last years. All these things would pose huge dilemmas for Europe if he does what he says, if he wins.
So tell me what you think could happen. For example, what he did say is, he's a big fan of tariffs. Now, the Biden administration didn't remove all those tariffs and then had the Inflation Reduction Act as well. So that was a bit of a concern. But he's talking about imposing 200% tariffs when it comes to China on imported goods. It's something much more dramatic than we saw before.
Right. It's a different world. It's true that there is this rising sort of tide of economic nationalism, not just in the United States, actually globally, where governments are reaching for tariffs as a solution, or own domestic investments, industrial policy, all this thing that leads us into greater competition across the Atlantic. But obviously what Donald Trump has been talking about takes us into different territory if he does what he says. This would be a tremendous structural change in economies. Also, how money is raised in the United States. Is even talking possibly about using tariffs instead of income taxes to raise federal revenue. This hasn't happened since the 19th century.
Yeah, how would it impact Europe, let's say, the tariffs? Let's have a look and see, from a trade point of view, what would happen to the European Union.
Well, the United States and Europe are the largest economic partners in the world in trade and investment. And Europe is highly dependent on trade. The United States somewhat less so. But it's hugely meaningful to both countries. We're the biggest economic partners for each other, respectively. And so anything that disturbs that makes it harder to do these transactions across the Atlantic is going to be a negative thing in terms of economic growth, but also in terms of costs to consumers, all sorts of things that people depend on both sides of the Atlantic.
And when you look at, let's say, the Draghi report and talking about how Europe is already sort of flailing and, could potentially die, using the language of President Macron, that obviously exacerbates the situation.
It does exacerbate the situation. It's one thing to have the challenges that Mario Draghi talks about in his report, or the IMF has said similar things recently, when things are going well, when economies around the world are growing. But that's not necessarily going to be the case under these conditions. Many economists say that if tariffs of this kind become the norm, not just in the United States, but elsewhere, that it would really suppress global growth in a way that would make all of those challenges much, much more dramatic.
Well, look, let's look at security, because we see Ukraine is still struggling. The victory plan of Vladimir Zelensky maybe hasn't had the traction that he would have liked. Member states, NATO, are still considering what he would like, and I think a lot of them are waiting to see what happens after this election. But Trump is saying that he could end the war in 24 hours. I mean, what would that look like? What kind of concessions would be imposed on Ukraine in a situation like that?
Well, I think he has in mind that that he would be able to send, well, two messages. One to President Zelensky, that either you go to the bargaining table or we stop the assistance. And similarly, he could go to President Putin and say, either you come to the bargaining table or we redouble our assistance to Ukraine. Whether any of this is realistic, it's very hard to say. Obviously, for Russia and for Ukraine, this is existential in different ways. For Russia, it's all about regime survival. For Ukraine, it's all about its sovereignty. Will they be inclined to compromise simply because Washington presses that? Perhaps not.
But, I mean, what would you even be more inclined to think that Trump might do, given his lauding of President Trump over the past few years?
Well, I think he doesn't know where it ends. And, you know, it is true that I think right across the political spectrum in the United States and in Europe, people are beginning to ask tougher questions, obviously, about what is the end game here? What is this peace plan? Yes, sure, for Ukraine to recover its territory and sovereignty fully, for an open door to NATO, for membership in NATO. Sure, but when? How? Is that conceivable in the near term? Probably not. So how does this stop, if not end?
And for NATO, that's another issue, because, you know, Trump has questioned his commitment to Article 5, for example, particularly of NATO allies who aren't paying at least the 2% of GDP. I mean, NATO is nothing without the US and Article 5.
Well, it's true. NATO can do many things, but in the current conditions with a war in Europe and this very severe problem of deterring Russia and other risks that exist out there, the U.S. capability is still absolutely essential. I mean, yes, maybe years from now, Europe, with a lot of investment, would be able to do much more. And there are also things that could happen in Asia that would draw the United States away, regardless of any kind of political decision-making about NATO in Washington. So there are plenty of things that Europe would want to reinsure itself against by building up its own defenses, but it's the work of many years to do that. And there is a very real risk, since former President Trump has a known attitude about NATO, that this debate is going to get much, much tougher. The problem, not just the debate, but the strategic problem, will get much, much tougher. That said, I don't think he's going to pull the United States out of NATO. There's still a lot of support for NATO in the public, on Capitol Hill, and at the end of the day, it's in American interest. But he could make life inside NATO very difficult indeed. Yeah,
that's the point, isn't it? It's not that he would take America out, but that within NATO he would block a lot. And we've seen the language of Trump-proofing over the past few months at NATO about institutionalizing Ukraine and support for Ukraine within NATO. Do you think that enough has been done there?
Well, an awful lot would have to be done. Of course, in NATO, everything is done by consensus. But absolutely everything, from the smallest thing to the most existential things, all done by consensus. So what the U.S. thinks and does really matters, just as others. And if the U.S. is not supportive of seeing NATO as a vehicle for doing this, it's going to make a huge difference.
What difference do you think a Kamala Harris presidency and a Trump presidency will have on member states within the European Union? Because you've seen Hungary, for example, hold back and block movement on the European Peace Facility, block initially, but having failed to block the access of the 50 billion euros from the G7. What impact would that have on member states and unanimity and so on there?
I think there would be a fundamental change in the American attitude towards the European Union if former President Trump comes to the White House again. Less so with President Harris, if she were to be president, Vice President Harris. I think it's important to consider what the Biden administration has done and how the Biden administration has seen Europe. The Biden administration has been really almost uniquely interested in seeing the European Union itself as an institution, as an interlocutor, on lots of things where we don't necessarily have to. Okay, on trade you have to do it, but you don't have to do it on a lot of other things. And they have been inclined to see the EU, to take it seriously, to see them as a key player. That wasn't always true in the past with Democratic or Republican administrations, different kinds. It certainly wouldn't be true in another Trump administration. For Harris, there would be a degree of continuity.
In what way?
Well, clearly there are some, Viktor Orban makes no secret about this, who would prefer to see a Trump presidency. Many would not, but in any case, Europe has to deal with what it gets.
I mean, the personality thing is very interesting because a lot of the people who worked with Donald Trump in the White House have come out and said that he's not fit for office, including former Chief of Staff John Kelly, who said that he would implement fascism and read out, the dictionary description of what fascism is and said this is Donald Trump. I mean, how do you respond to something like that?
Well, I understand why people are troubled by this. I mean, it is troubling to talk in those terms, I think. We have another problem, of course, which is that the governance in the United States has proved extremely dysfunctional in recent years. It's not just that the country is highly polarized. In the Senate, in Congress, it's very difficult to get people confirmed, for example. And that's one of the reasons why Trump is talking in terms of, having more, in a sense, political appointees and shrinking the civil service and having more accountable political appointees. We already have that system, actually. But it's not as sweeping as he's proposing, and it doesn't have the kind of tough measures that he's talking about, obviously. It would be very different. It's really uncharted territory for the United States.
Okay. Dr. Ian Lesser, Distinguished Fellow with the German Marshall Fund, thank you very much for joining us on the Europe Conversation.
Good to be with you. Thank you.